You laughed because it hadn't happened yet, not because it wouldn't. That's the line that hits first, because it tells the whole story in one breath. Someone spoke early, maybe too early for your comfort, and you were quick to judge the timing instead of the truth. It's like mocking a seed because it hasn't broken the ground yet, acting smart while standing over dirt, unaware that roots are already busy underground, doing silent damage to your certainty. The funny part is this: seeds don't rush. They don't argue. They just grow. And one day the ground splits and everyone suddenly pretends they saw it coming. Now pause here, because this is exactly what this moment is about. Bro, you spoke too soon, and now it's all coming true. Isn't just a line, it's a pattern. It's that uncomfortable phase where words leave the mouth before reality catches up, and people mistake early vision for arrogance. They hear confidence and call it delusion. They see calm certainty and label it ego. What they don't see is the internal work already finished before the external proof shows up. Here's a fact that messes with people. Studies in psychology show that individuals with strong future orientation often verbalize outcomes early, not because they're guessing, but because their brain already recognizes patterns forming. Their nervous system locks onto direction before results show up. Translation in simple terms: you weren't talking nonsense. You were responding to signals others couldn't read yet. You didn't speak from hope. You spoke from alignment. That's why your words sounded crazy at the time. The environment didn't match them. The numbers didn't support them. Your situation didn't look impressive enough to justify that tone. So people laughed. Some smiled politely. Some got annoyed. A few quietly rooted against you because confidence without permission makes people uncomfortable. But here's the twist they never consider. Timing doesn't decide truth. Truth decides timing. And now, look at the shift. The same words they joked about are slowly turning into headlines in your life. The same statements they dismissed are lining up one by one like receipts. What's happening isn't loud yet, but it's consistent. And consistency scares people more than noise ever could. The silence from the critics is getting heavy. The jokes stopped landing. The comments slowed down. Because nothing rattles someone more than watching reality side with the person they doubted. Before we go any further, pause for a second. If this message feels uncomfortably accurate, if it feels like it's tapping you on the shoulder instead of shouting at you, then Chosen One, this is your moment. And thank you, Chosen One. Don't forget to pay this message back by simply pressing like and subscribe to help spread this message to more souls. It's the responsibility of all of us to spread the light. Thank you for being part of this mission. You're part of a force, whether you fully see it yet or not. Now back to the point, because this gets deeper. The real reason people say you spoke too soon is because your confidence disrupted their timeline. You weren't supposed to know yet. You weren't supposed to say it out loud. You were supposed to wait for permission, proof, applause, or approval. When you skipped those steps, it exposed something uncomfortable. It exposed how reactive most people are to life instead of intentional. There's another interesting fact worth sitting with. People who visualize outcomes clearly often experience a phenomenon where language changes before behavior does. They start speaking in when instead of if. Not because they're reckless, but because their brain has already accepted the outcome as inevitable. That's why your words sounded final while your situation still looked messy. You had already mentally crossed a finish line others hadn't even located on the map. That's also why the enemy, the doubter, the quiet hater, feels uneasy right now. Because this isn't luck. Luck is random. This is patterned. Step by step, your life is lining up with statements you made when you had no evidence to back them up. And the scariest part for them isn't that it's happening. It's that you weren't shocked when it started to happen. You expected it. You moved like someone waiting for a delayed train, not like someone hoping a miracle might show up. Let's be honest for a moment. You didn't speak too soon. You spoke from a higher vantage point. While others were zoomed in on the struggle, you were looking at direction. While they were counting current losses, you were counting trajectory. That's why your words aged well. They didn't need defending, they just needed time. And now time is doing the talking for you. The same mouths that said calm down are now saying, you really did that. The same eyes that rolled are now watching closely, some with respect, some with envy, some with confusion. Because it's hard to argue with results, especially when those results arrive exactly where you said they would. This intro isn't about bragging, it's about confirmation. It's about that quiet moment when you realize your inner voice was never lying, just early. It's about recognizing that speaking your truth before it's visible doesn't make you foolish. It makes you ahead. And being ahead always looks crazy to people standing still. So if you're here, listening to this, feeling that strange mix of validation and pressure, understand this. You're not being watched because you failed. You're being watched because you called it. And now, as it all starts lining up piece by piece, the title says it all. Bro, you spoke too soon, and now it's all coming true. And now, chosen one, pause with me for a second before we go any further. If you're still here, it's not by accident. Something about this message is already matching what you've been seeing play out in real time. The words you spoke, the looks they gave you, the silence that followed, and now, the proof starting to show up. So here's the deal. Stay with this, because what comes next connects the dots step by step, and once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. This isn't background noise content. This is the kind of message people click off too early and regret later when reality finishes the sentence for them. If this is hitting home, let it be known. Drop a comment with 777 to mark that you're locked in and ready to understand why speaking early didn't ruin you, it positioned you. And if you feel it, support the work behind this message in whatever way you can. Not because of money, not because of obligation, but because ideas like this only spread when people who recognize truth decide to back it. Every bit of support pushes this message further to people who need to hear it before their own words start coming true. Now, take a breath, lock your focus, and stay right here, because from this point on, we're breaking it down clean, calm, and step by step. And trust me, if this title already feels personal, what comes next is going to feel uncomfortably accurate. Let's get into it. Number 1. You didn't speak too soon. You heard the ending while they were still stuck on the intro. They laughed because you said it early. They'll go quiet because you said it right. Let's be clear from the start, because this part bruises egos. The problem was never your words. The problem was their timing. You spoke from a place they hadn't reached yet, and that alone made them uncomfortable. People love confidence only when it arrives after proof. Confidence before proof feels like an insult to their patience, their limits, and their small expectations. So when you opened your mouth and said something bold, something final, something that sounded like it belonged to a future version of you, they didn't hear vision. They heard a threat. Here's the part they never want to admit. Alignment doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It doesn't knock loudly. It whispers. It shows up as a quiet inner shift before anything outside changes. You start tolerating less nonsense. Certain conversations stop fitting, old goals feel too small, and without trying to sound dramatic, your language changes. You stop saying maybe, you stop saying hopefully, you start speaking in statements. That's when people get nervous. You weren't trying to prove anything. You weren't trying to flex. You were responding to an internal click that already happened. Something inside you locked into place before the results showed up, and your mouth followed that internal alignment automatically. That's why your words came out calm, sure, and non-negotiable. And to people still living in hesitation, certainty sounds offensive. Think of it like this. You were reading the map while they were arguing about the weather. You saw the direction clearly, even if the road was still under construction. Meanwhile, they were obsessed with potholes, delays, and excuses. So, when you said where you were going, it sounded ridiculous to them. Not because it was wrong, but because they couldn't imagine moving with that level of clarity. A lot of chosen ones struggle with this question right here. If I was so aligned, why did everything still look messy? Simple answer. Alignment isn't decoration, it's foundation. It gets built underground. And anything built underground looks invisible until it's strong enough to hold weight. You were laying structure while they were waiting for applause. Here's a psychological truth that hits harder the more you sit with it. People who experience internal alignment early often face social resistance, not support. Why? Because your certainty forces others to confront their own indecision. Your clarity becomes a mirror, and most people hate mirrors that show them standing still. That's why they said you were talking big. That's why they hinted you should calm down. That's why some of them secretly hoped you'd fail, just so they could feel right again. You weren't delusional, you were early. And early always looks arrogant to people who move late. Let's address another quiet fear you might have had. What if I jinxed it by saying it out loud? That's nonsense sold to people who don't trust themselves. Words don't ruin alignment. Insecure people do. Your words didn't create pressure. They revealed commitment. And commitment scares people who live in backups and excuses. Notice something else. The louder they laughed back then, the quieter they are now. Because alignment has a sound, and once reality starts echoing your words, there's nothing left to debate. They can't argue with progress. They can't joke away consistency. They can only watch. And watching is torture when you underestimated someone. You see, the real reason they're unsettled isn't because you're succeeding. It's because you succeeded in the exact direction you named out loud. If you had randomly stumbled into something else, they could call it luck. But this is precision. This is you walking into rooms you described before the door even existed. That's the part that messes with their head. Another metaphor for you. You were hearing thunder miles away while they were judging the clear sky above their house. When the storm finally arrived, they acted surprised. You didn't. You had already closed the windows mentally. That's alignment. Quiet awareness before loud reality. And let's be honest, some of them still want to believe you just got lucky. They need that story to sleep at night. Because admitting you heard it coming means admitting they ignored their own whispers for years, and that's a heavy truth to carry. This section is important because it answers the doubt creeping in sometimes. Should I have kept my mouth shut? No. Silence would have made you smaller, not safer. You didn't speak too soon. You spoke from the version of you that was already done waiting. The universe doesn't respond to noise. it responds to clarity, and clarity changes how you move, how you choose, how you endure discomfort without folding. Your words weren't magic spells. They were declarations of direction. And direction, once chosen, bends outcomes over time. So if you're feeling that strange mix of pride and pressure right now, understand this. The pressure isn't a warning, it's confirmation. You're carrying something real, something consistent, something that doesn't need defending anymore. They underestimated how loudly alignment whispers before it becomes undeniable. They thought silence meant nothing was happening. They mistook patience for weakness. They confused early vision with fantasy. And now, as the pieces fall into place exactly where you said they would, the title keeps proving itself. You spoke early, they spoke doubt, and now reality picked a side. Number 2, you didn't guess the outcome. You recognized it like an old scar you forgot you had. They call it confidence. You call it déjà vu. This is where the confusion really starts for the enemy, because what they think was prediction was actually recognition. You weren't standing at the edge of the present, trying to imagine a random future. You were standing in the present, remembering something that already felt familiar. That's the part they can't compute. Most people only trust what they can see forming. You trusted what felt inevitable long before it showed its face. There's a kind of knowing that doesn't come from charts, plans, or evidence. It doesn't feel loud or dramatic either. It feels calm, solid, almost boring in its certainty. When you spoke those words, the ones they mocked, you weren't hyping yourself up. You weren't manifesting for attention. You were calmly stating something your system already accepted as done. That's why there was no panic in your voice. That's why you didn't keep explaining yourself. You don't explain memories, you just recall them. Imagine this for a second. You walk into a room you haven't visited in years, but the layout hits you instantly. You know where the light switch is. You know where the chair used to sit. You don't need directions because your body remembers before your mind catches up. That's what this was. Your future felt like a room you'd already been in, so when you talked about it, it came out naturally, casually, almost annoyingly certain. You weren't dreaming big, you were recalling what already fit you. This is where others get it wrong. They think belief always starts in the mind. For chosen ones, it starts deeper. It starts as recognition. Something inside you goes, "Oh, this again." And that's unsettling for people who live life like everything is brand new and terrifying. Your calm certainty messes with their fear-based planning. Here's a question you might have asked yourself quietly. If I already knew, why did it still take time? Because knowing doesn't erase process. Remembering the destination doesn't cancel the road. You still had steps to walk, skills to sharpen, pressure to survive. But the ending was never in question for you. Only the timing was. Imagine watching a movie you've already seen, but this time you're sitting with people who haven't. They gasp, they panic, they lean forward. You just watch calmly because you know how it ends. That was you, living inside situations that stressed everyone else out, while something in you stayed oddly steady. They thought you were reckless. You were just informed. They were hoping. You were recognizing. That's the difference. This explains why their reactions never changed your direction. They tried doubt. They tried jokes. They tried discouragement, disguised as concern. None of it stuck. Because doubt only works when the outcome is still undecided inside you. Yours wasn't. You didn't need reassurance, because reassurance is for uncertainty. You had familiarity. Here's another metaphor that hits hard. You weren't writing a new story. You were rereading a chapter you'd skimmed once before. That's why your words sounded ahead of their time. You weren't inventing confidence. You were speaking from memory, and memory doesn't shake under pressure. This also answers another question that creeps in. Why didn't I feel shocked when things started working? Because surprises only happen when outcomes feel foreign. This didn't feel foreign. It felt overdue, like finally meeting someone you've talked about forever. Relief, not shock. There's an interesting psychological angle here too. People who experience strong internal recognition often struggle to explain their certainty because it doesn't come from logic chains. It comes from pattern familiarity. And when you can't explain something step by step, people assume it's fake. What they don't understand is that some truths aren't assembled. They're recalled. They needed proof. You needed timing. Imagine this. A compass doesn't argue with the terrain. It doesn't panic when the road twists. It just points north. That was you. Calm direction in chaotic conditions. Others kept checking the map, doubting the route, second-guessing every turn. You kept moving, not faster, just steadier. And let's hit the enemy honestly here. The reason they're uncomfortable now is because your certainty makes their hesitation look expensive. They waited, you remembered, they stalled, you moved, and now they're watching outcomes unfold in the exact order you hinted at before you had permission to be right. Some of them want to say you got lucky, some want to say you changed later. Both are coping stories, because admitting you knew all along means admitting they ignored their own internal signals for years, and that's a heavier loss than missing out on success. Luck doesn't follow a script this precise. Memory does. This section matters because it reframes everything. You weren't predicting a future you hoped for. You were confirming a path you had already accepted internally. That's why your words didn't wobble. That's why your energy didn't beg. That's why even when things slowed down, you didn't quit. You don't quit on things you recognize as yours. Imagine seeing your name already engraved on a door, even if it's still locked. You don't bang on it. You don't argue with people walking past. You wait. You prepare. You know it opens eventually. That's what your confidence was built on. Ownership before access. And now that it's starting to open piece by piece, the reactions around you are shifting. Confusion, curiosity, quiet observation. That's the sound of people realizing you weren't guessing, you were remembering. So no, you weren't creating fantasies, you weren't speaking nonsense, you weren't tempting fate. You were calmly acknowledging something that already felt real to you long before it looked real to them. They called it speaking too soon. You called it honesty. And now, as reality keeps matching the words you spoke back then, one truth is getting louder every day. You didn't predict what was coming, you recognized it, and that's why none of this feels new to you at all. Number 3. Your confidence didn't annoy them, it exposed what they never had the nerve to become. They didn't hate your words. They hated the mirror your words turned them into. Let's stop pretending this was ever about you being loud, arrogant, or unrealistic. It wasn't. Your confidence didn't bother them because it was wrong. It bothered them because it was clean, steady, and unapologetic. You spoke with a calm certainty that didn't ask for approval, and that hit a nerve, not a surface nerve, a deep one. The kind connected to dreams they once had and quietly buried. Here's the part most people miss. When someone speaks boldly about their direction, it forces everyone listening to subconsciously compare paths. And when that comparison exposes hesitation, fear, or regret, discomfort follows. Your certainty highlighted the gap between where they are and where they once wanted to be. Instead of facing that gap, they aimed at you. Mockery is cheaper than courage. Doubt is easier than action. Your confidence wasn't loud, their insecurity was. Imagine this. You're walking straight toward a finish line, not running, not rushing, just moving with intent. On the sidelines are people who stopped training years ago, telling themselves stories about why it didn't matter anyway. Now imagine you casually saying, "I'm almost there." That sentence alone threatens every excuse they've been living on. Of course they scoff. Of course they roll their eyes. If you're right, then their comfort zone has a price tag. Another image. You lit a torch in a dark room, not to show off, but to see where you were going. Instead of adjusting their eyes, they complained about the light. Your confidence wasn't blinding, it was revealing. And not everyone wants to see what's been sitting untouched in the corners of their life. Here's a question you might have asked yourself. Why did they react so strongly when I wasn't attacking anyone? Because confidence without permission feels like rebellion to people who live by consensus. You didn't wait for validation. You didn't lower your tone to make others comfortable. That alone made you dangerous. You reminded them of a version of themselves they gave up on. Now comes the quiet twist. The same confidence they labeled as delusion back then is the exact confidence they envy now. As your words start matching reality, their reactions change. Less jokes, more watching, less commentary, more silence. Envy rarely announces itself loudly. It studies quietly. Think of it like this. You kept building while they kept coping. You kept moving while they kept explaining. And now the distance between you isn't theoretical anymore. It's visible. That's when admiration mixes with resentment. And resentment hides behind fake support. Here's the truth that seals this section. Your confidence wasn't meant to convince them. It was meant to carry you. And it did. The universe responds to direction, not approval. You chose direction. They chose comfort. So no, they weren't offended by your words. They were offended by what your courage said about their fear. And now that your early confidence is turning into real-world proof, the roles are clear. You kept going. They kept watching. And deep down, they know exactly why this hurts. Number 4. You didn't shock them with arrogance. You terrified them with possibility. They didn't think you were wrong. They just couldn't think that far. This part is brutal for them, so let's not soften it. You didn't expose their limits by arguing, proving, or flexing. You exposed them by speaking normally about a future they couldn't even picture. While they were measuring life with a tiny ruler, you were talking in wide angles. And instead of expanding their imagination, they shrank you in their mind. That was easier. Here's the truth they hate sitting with. People judge ideas based on the size of their own imagination, not on reality. When you spoke about where you were headed, they didn't test your words against what was possible. They tested them against what they personally believed they could achieve. And since they couldn't see themselves doing it, they assumed no one could. That's not logic. That's projection. They confused their ceiling with the sky. Imagine this. You're describing a city you've researched deeply, studied, mapped out. You know the streets, the shortcuts, the landmarks. They've never left their neighborhood. When you talk, they nod politely, but internally think, that place doesn't exist. Not because it isn't real, but because they've never been there mentally. That's exactly what happened. Your vision sounded unrealistic only because their mental world was small. Another way to see it. You were playing chess 3 moves ahead, calmly explaining the end game. They were still arguing about the opening. When you said checkmate was coming, they laughed. Now the board is clearing, and suddenly they're quiet, staring at the pieces like something went wrong. Nothing went wrong. They just couldn't imagine what you already calculated. Your words weren't big. Their thinking was small. This answers a question you may have asked yourself. Why were they so sure I was wrong? Because believing you would succeed required them to admit they never tried. Disbelief protected their comfort. If they labeled your vision impossible, they didn't have to confront why they settled. Now reality is doing something uncomfortable. It's matching your words step by step, not dramatically, not all at once, but accurately. And accuracy is deadly to disbelief, because now they're forced to admit something quietly. They didn't doubt you because of facts. They doubted you because of imagination. They ran out of vision long before you ran out of patience. You didn't need to convince them. You just needed time. Time expands what fear tries to shrink, and as your life unfolds exactly where you said it would, the truth lands hard. You didn't exaggerate, you out-imagined them, and that difference is now impossible to ignore. Number 5. They thought nothing was happening because they couldn't see the work you were doing in the dark. They judged your silence as stagnation, not realizing it was construction. This is where their logic completely failed them. They assumed growth only counts if it's loud, public, and easy to measure. If there were no announcements, no constant updates, no visible wins, they decided nothing was changing. What they didn't understand is that the most dangerous growth happens quietly, internally, where no one gets a front row seat. You were fighting battles they never knew existed. Late nights where doubt tried to negotiate with you. Moments where quitting would have been reasonable, but you stayed anyway. Shifts in discipline, mindset, and tolerance that don't show up on the surface. While they were watching the scoreboard, you were upgrading the player, and that's why they misread you. They watched the surface. You rebuilt the foundation. Imagine this. Someone walks past a construction site every day and sees nothing changing above ground. No walls, no floors, just dirt. They laugh and say, "Nothing's happening here." What they don't see is the underground work, the measurements, the structure being laid so the building doesn't collapse later. Then one day, the frame shoots up fast. Overnight it seems sudden. To them, it looks like luck. To you, it feels overdue. That's exactly what this was. Your growth was invisible because it wasn't meant for spectators. It was meant for survival. You were learning restraint, sharpening focus, unlearning habits that kept you small. That kind of work doesn't post well. It doesn't impress crowds, but it changes outcomes. Here's a question you might have wrestled with. If I was growing, why did it feel lonely? Because internal growth isolates by default. When you're evolving faster on the inside than your environment is on the outside, you outgrow conversations before you outgrow circumstances. That gap feels uncomfortable. They mistook that quiet distance for failure. It wasn't. They underestimated you because they only count progress they can witness. Now the invisible has crossed into visible, subtle at first, then undeniable. The way you move is different, the choices are cleaner, the results start stacking, and suddenly their old judgments look foolish, because nothing exposes shallow observation like delayed proof. They didn't believe you because they never saw the work, but the universe saw it. And now reality is translating all that unseen effort into outcomes they can't ignore. They called it nothing. You called it preparation. Number 6. You didn't talk big. You outgrew the cage and refused to whisper on the way out. They called it bragging because they've never watched someone shed a skin in real time. Let's kill the fake narrative right here. You weren't bragging. Bragging is loud insecurity begging for witnesses. What you did was different. You spoke because the old version of you had expired, and staying silent would have meant lying to yourself. Your words weren't about flexing, they were about oxygen. You were breaking out of something that no longer fit, and anyone who's never escaped their own limits mistakes freedom for ego. Here's what really happened. You hit a moment where shrinking started to hurt more than speaking. Staying quiet felt heavier than being misunderstood, so you said it out loud, not to convince them, to confirm it for yourself. That's not arrogance, that's courage with a pulse. You weren't announcing success, you were declaring independence from who you used to be. Imagine this: a snake doesn't apologize for shedding its skin. It doesn't ask the old version for permission. It leaves it behind because survival demands growth. When you spoke, you were doing the same thing, leaving behind habits, labels, and expectations that kept you small. Of course, it startled people. They were comfortable with the version of you that didn't challenge their assumptions. Another image. You were stepping out of a cramped room into open air, and the sound they heard wasn't bragging. It was a door slamming shut behind you. People who benefit from your silence always call your voice a problem. This answers the question that creeps in. Why did they react like I crossed a line? Because you did. You crossed out of a role they had you memorized in. When you speak from a new identity, it destabilizes old dynamics. They preferred you predictable. You chose honest. Your words weren't early. Their expectations were outdated. They labeled it premature because courage makes cowards uncomfortable. They needed you to wait until results gave them permission to respect you. You didn't wait. You moved first, and now that movement is pulling reality with it. Here's the clean truth. Speaking wasn't bragging, it was the sound of chains hitting the floor. And once you hear that sound, there's no going back to pretending the cage was home. Number 7. You didn't just speak early. You quietly proved you were built to hold what you asked for. Anyone can talk when it's easy. You stayed solid when nothing backed you up. This part matters more than most people realize, because your early words weren't just statements. They were a test, not a test for the world, a test for you. When you said what you said, before there was proof, applause, or momentum, something invisible started watching one thing only: your consistency. Would you panic when nothing moved? Would you backpedal when doubt got loud? Would you soften your tone when people pushed back? And here's the part you didn't even know at the time. You passed. Most people fail this stage quietly. They speak boldly once, don't see instant results, then slowly retreat. They rewrite the story. They joke it off. They pretend they never meant it seriously. You didn't. You stayed aligned, even when it was uncomfortable, even when time stretched, even when silence made things awkward. That steadiness is rare. You didn't fold when nothing happened. That's what changed everything. Imagine planting a flag on a hill before the road exists. Anyone can do that for a day. Very few stand there through storms, delays, and doubt without moving the flag back. You didn't keep explaining yourself. You didn't keep re-announcing. You simply stayed. That's conviction. And conviction always gets noticed, even when it looks like nothing's happening. Here's a question that probably crossed your mind back then. Did I mess up by saying it too soon? No. That question was part of the test. If you had doubted yourself into silence, the alignment would have cracked. But you didn't shrink. You adjusted quietly and kept moving forward. The weight didn't weaken you. It trained you. Another way to see it. You were lifting weight no one else could see. Every day you didn't quit, didn't explain, didn't collapse into insecurity. You got stronger. And strength built that way doesn't wobble when success shows up. That's why what's unfolding now isn't overwhelming you. You already carried the pressure before the results arrived. This is why things are lining up now, not because you spoke early, but because you stayed steady afterward. The universe responds to follow-through, not noise. You proved you could hold the identity before you held the outcome. So yes, your early words were a test, and without realizing it, you passed it clean. That's why what's coming doesn't feel random. It feels earned. Number 8, they didn't doubt you out of logic. They doubted you because you slipped out of their grip. Disbelief is the last tool people use when control stops working. This was never about facts, timing, or realism. Their disbelief wasn't some rational assessment of your situation. It was a reflex. The moment you spoke with certainty, something shifted. You stopped being manageable. You stopped fitting neatly into the version of you they understood, influenced, or subtly directed. And that scared them. Here's the part that matters. Control loves predictability. When people feel they can anticipate your limits, your pace, your ceiling, they feel safe. Your words shattered that safety. You spoke like someone who had already stepped outside their reach. And when control senses escape, it panics. That panic shows up as doubt, criticism, and fake concern. They didn't question your vision, they questioned their access to you. Imagine this. Someone is used to holding the leash loosely, not pulling it, just knowing it's there. The moment you walk forward and the leash slips out of their hand, they don't say, "I lost control." They say, "You're being unrealistic." That's what happened. Your certainty wasn't offensive. It was uncontrollable. Another image. You were a character in a story they thought they understood. When you started speaking lines that didn't match the script they had in their head, they got uncomfortable, not because the lines were wrong, but because they weren't the director anymore. This answers a question you may have asked yourself. Why did they react emotionally instead of logically? Because logic wasn't driving them. Fear was. Fear of losing influence, fear of being left behind, fear of watching someone rise without needing their approval. They called it disbelief. It was really resistance. Now look at where things are. Your life has shifted just far enough beyond their influence that they can't steer it anymore. They can't slow it down with comments. They can't redirect it with doubt. All they can do now is watch. And watching a reality you can't control is deeply uncomfortable. That's why the energy changed. Less pushback, more distance, less commentary, more silence. Because control doesn't argue when it's lost. It observes. Their disbelief wasn't about you being wrong. It was about you being free. And now that freedom is visible, undeniable, and moving forward without permission. Number 9. You didn't jump the gun. You refused to keep living below what you already knew was yours. You spoke early because staying silent would have meant agreeing to less than you deserved. This part cuts deeper than people realize, because before anything showed up on the outside, something settled on the inside. You already knew. Not in an entitled way, not in a fantasy way, in a quiet, grounded way that said, "This isn't it. This can't be it. And once that knowing locks in, silence becomes betrayal. You didn't speak early to rush the process. You spoke because pretending you were okay with less was no longer an option. People assume desire comes after proof. For you, worth came first. You didn't wake up one day and randomly decide you deserved more. You arrived at that conclusion after outgrowing rooms, conversations, and expectations that felt too small. That's why your words sounded firm. They weren't hopeful, they were corrective. You didn't demand more, you acknowledged it. Imagine wearing shoes 2 sizes too small for years. At first you adjust. You tell yourself it's fine. Eventually, every step hurts. The moment you say, "These don't fit," someone accuses you of complaining. But you're not complaining. You're refusing damage. Speaking early was you taking the shoes off before the injury became permanent. Here's a question you may have wrestled with. Was I being impatient? No. Impatience wants shortcuts. You wanted alignment. You didn't rush outcomes. You rejected confinement. There's a difference. Another image. You were already sitting at a table mentally while still physically standing outside the room. When you spoke, you weren't lying. You were telling the truth about where you belonged, even if the door hadn't opened yet. Your unseen self had already signed off on the future. That unseen version of you had done the math. It knew what you could carry, what you could learn, and what you were done tolerating. The outer world just hadn't caught up yet, so you said it out loud, not to force reality, to honor yourself. And now, as proof starts arriving, people act surprised. You're not. This isn't new to you, it's familiar. Because long before results showed up, the decision was already made inside. You didn't speak early because you were reckless. You spoke because you knew your worth. And once that knowing settles in, everything else has no choice but to follow. Number 10. They measured you by who you were. You were quietly becoming someone they couldn't catch up to. They underestimated you because they assumed you were finished growing. This is where the distance becomes obvious, and there's no clever explanation left to hide behind. They judged you using an outdated snapshot, an old version, a moment in time that felt convenient for them. What they didn't realize is that while they were forming opinions, you were forming momentum. And momentum doesn't ask to be understood. It just keeps moving. They thought growth was linear, slow, and visible. They assumed if they couldn't see progress, it wasn't happening. So they spoke about you with confidence, thinking they had you figured out. Meanwhile, you were building tomorrow's version of yourself in places they never bothered to look. Internally, strategically, patiently. They thought they knew your limits because they never checked for updates. Imagine judging a book by its rough draft and thinking you've read the final chapter. That's what they did. They made conclusions based on who you used to be, not realizing that version was already outdated the moment they opened their mouth. While they were talking, you were editing. While they were assuming, you were upgrading. Here's the question that usually hits around this point. Why do they seem so shocked now? Because people hate being proven wrong by time, especially when they were confident in their doubt. Your progress didn't just surprise them, it embarrassed their certainty. The gap between what they expected and what's actually happening keeps widening, and there's nothing they can do to shrink it. You didn't change suddenly. You revealed yourself gradually. Another way to see it. They were watching the rearview mirror, convinced that was the whole road. You were focused forward, stacking days, choices, and discipline. When the results started showing, it felt sudden to them. To you, it felt earned. This is the quiet power of progress. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it just arrives. And when it does, it forces people to confront how deeply they misjudged you, not because you tricked them, because you outgrew their assumptions. Now the contrast is undeniable. Their expectations are stuck in the past. Your reality is moving forward. And that gap, that's the sound of underestimation collapsing under proof. Number 11. You terrified them, because you did what no one from your starting point was supposed to do. They didn't doubt you because it was impossible. They doubted you because it had never happened from where you stood. This one cuts straight through the excuses because their disbelief wasn't personal. It was historical. No one they knew had risen from your position. No blueprint, no familiar example, no success story they could reference to feel safe believing in you. So they defaulted to denial. When people can't place something inside their mental library, they label it unrealistic instead of unfamiliar. They looked at your background, your circumstances, your timing, your resources, and quietly decided the ending for you. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Humans trust patterns, and in their world, people from your position didn't break through. They stayed where they were. They adjusted expectations. They learned to cope. You didn't. They weren't measuring you against reality. They were measuring you against history. Imagine this. Every race they've ever watched from the same starting line ended the same way. Same winners, same outcomes. Then you show up and say, "I'm taking this somewhere else." Of course they laugh. Not because you're wrong, but because you're unfamiliar. You weren't playing the role they'd memorized. Here's the question that might have crossed your mind. Why did they seem so sure I couldn't do it? Because believing you would succeed meant accepting that limits they inherited weren't laws. They were habits. And habits feel safer than possibility. Another image. You were building a bridge where no road existed before. They stood at the edge saying, "There's nothing there." You kept building anyway. And now, as the structure holds weight, their certainty collapses. Not because you argued better, but because you proved something new could exist. Your success didn't follow the script. It replaced it. This is the uncomfortable truth. Your rise forced a rewrite. It challenged the quiet agreement people had with their own ceilings. If you could do it from there, then excuses everywhere start shaking. That's why some people celebrate you loudly and others go quiet. Both reactions come from the same realization. The narrative changed. They didn't believe you because no one had done it before, and now, because you did, the story has a new reference point. You didn't just succeed. You expanded what people think is possible from where you started. And that's why this was never going to make sense to them until it happened. Number 12. Your breakthrough didn't arrive late. They were still catching up to what you'd already figured out. You weren't behind schedule, you were ahead of their comprehension. This is where the story finally flips cleanly. They keep saying your breakthrough took time, that it finally happened, that it was overdue. But that framing is wrong from the start. Your breakthrough wasn't late. Their understanding was. You were moving on a different timeline the entire time, one that didn't wait for group consensus or shared awareness. You saw the turn before the road sign showed up. People assume progress should make sense to everyone at the same moment. That's not how real momentum works. Perception always lags behind movement. You felt the shift internally long before it registered externally, and long before others could interpret it. While they were still processing old data about you, you had already updated the system. They were judging the clock. You were reading the compass. Imagine this. You're on a train that quietly switches tracks before it speeds up. From the outside, it looks like nothing changed. Same direction, same motion. But internally, the destination is now completely different. By the time the speed becomes obvious, it's too late to debate the turn. That's what happened with you. The real change occurred earlier than they realized. Here's the question that usually surfaces here. Why did they act shocked when things finally clicked? Because people confuse awareness with reality. Just because they noticed it late doesn't mean it started late. Your progress didn't wait for their recognition. It moved regardless. Another image. You were speaking a language they didn't understand yet. When fluency finally spread, they assumed you had just learned it. In reality, you'd been practicing quietly for years. Their delay in understanding made your growth look sudden. It wasn't. Your timing was precise. Their perception was delayed. This is why your confidence stayed steady. You weren't guessing. You were ahead. And being ahead always looks wrong to people behind. Until it doesn't. Now the picture is clear. The breakthrough aligns perfectly with what you said early on. The only thing that was off was their interpretation of time. You didn't arrive late. You arrived exactly when you were supposed to. They just needed longer to catch up to the truth you were already living. So if you're still here, let this land properly. You weren't loud. You weren't crazy. You weren't early for no reason. You saw it before it showed, said it before it settled, and stood on it while others laughed. And now reality is doing what reality always does. It catches up to the truth. If this message spoke to you, press the like button if you haven't already. And if you're not part of this family yet, make sure to hit subscribe. Stay close. Because this story isn't over. It's just getting visible.